Hello, everybody. Welcome to Subtle Asian Book Club. I am Alexandra, also known as Twirling Pages, and I'm here with my co-host Tiffany, also known as Read by Tiffany, and we're super excited to talk about our September book of the month, which is Tomb Sweeping, and we're here with the author Alexandra Chang. So Alexandra, can you please introduce yourself and your books? And as a quick icebreaker, what was your favorite book so far this year?
Thanks so much for having me. I'm Alexandra Chang, as you mentioned. I am the author of the novel Days of Distraction, which came out in 2020, and most recently the story collection Tomb Sweeping, which I'm very grateful you've chosen up as the September book club read. The collection is about many things. It follows many characters ranging in age and background and sort of like situation. But what I say is that it follows people who are going through some sort of transition or dealing with some kind of loss. And it's very much about ordinary people dealing with these sort of seemingly ordinary transitions, but the stakes, the emotional stakes of those experiences. And my favorite read of the year, it's very hard to choose, so I'm going with my favorite reads of the past couple months. One book that I really loved was Terrace Story by Hilary Leichter. This is like a very magical book. The premise is basically these people live in a tiny apartment. They have a friend who comes over, and when she comes over, this closet in their house turns into a terrace. And I'll leave it at that. It follows like multiple characters who are sort of related to this experience. And then a book that I'm just about done with and very into, and it's coming out on Tuesday, is Land of Milk and Honey by Pam Jung. And so that's coming out Tuesday. Those two have been my favorites of the last couple months.
Oh, so exciting.
Yeah. So many books coming out that are really fun too.
The TBR is never ending, but I'm sure it's also just as difficult as an author. You guys have to like keep up with all of us being like, we want more books. So jumping into the first question, Tomb Sweeping is a beautiful and moving collection of stories. We're really curious about what inspired the different stories in the collection and what inspires your short fiction in general.
A lot of different sources. So each story, I think, is inspired by something different. So it can be something as simple as a line of dialogue that I overhear, or that someone who's close to me has said to me, and that will inspire a story. Or it might be a setting that I find compelling. It could be a situation that I find funny or awkward. For example, there's a story, Phenotype, in the book that was inspired by a barbecue that I went to that I just thought was like a very awkward experience. And I was like, okay, why did this happen? Who are the characters behind this kind of experience? So it's usually I would say my short fiction is usually drawn from something that I find interesting, and then questions around that source.
When you described it like the barbecue, I was like, oh, it sounds like people watching, but like the next level.
Yeah. I will say that like a lot of my work typically is drawn from like something that I've directly experienced or directly witnessed, and have like the desire to understand better. So yeah, that barbecue is something that I was really a bystander of, but had so many questions about that led to this story. And that story also was very much driven by voice. And so voice is something that if a character's voice comes to me, I think is like, I don't know, there's some quirky way of speech, or if there's just like an ability of that character to observe something that I find, I don't know, again, it's just like drawn to, then that will often lead to a story.
Yeah.
And wait, sorry, before we jump to the next question, I just have to ask, like, what inspired cat personalities? Because
Oh, yeah.
Alexandra was reading like several stories before me, and she was like, "You're gonna like this one. It's so you." And I also noticed that you have a cat in the background in your
Yeah.
paintings. I was just like,
I have 2 cats, so I'm very into cats. That story was kind of what I was saying, where like somebody I know says something, I'm like, oh, that is a very interesting observation, and like, how can I use that in a story? So a friend of mine talked about how cats take on the personalities of their caretakers. I don't want to say owners, but basically cats taking on the personality of their people. And I was like, okay, let's run with that. And it became a story not only about just like that kind of funny statement, but about a friendship that starts to like describe itself through these cats.
Yeah. No, I love the story because as I was reading it, I was like, I feel like I've had this conversation with Tiffany, even though I definitely haven't, because like neither of us have cats. And like neither of us, or actually it's funny because like I think last week Tiffany was like considering getting a cat, and that's also why I was like, oh, like this kind of reminds me of you. But yeah, I was reading it and I was like, their like banter really reminds me of us sometimes. And I really like loved like reading about friendship. So I love that story.
Yeah, I hope that it's not a devolving friendship like the one depicted in the story, though.
Oh no. We're still not. We are still here. You catch us running the book club years and years later. It's like
Yeah.
we're still going.
But yeah, that story is just like a very silly way of like talking around a relationship. And I think talking about pets is a very good way of talking about relationships between people. Like even my husband and I will sometimes like talk through our dog. Like Irving is sad. He wants to go outside. Like Irving wants like attention right now. But of course, we're just like speaking about ourselves.
No, that makes sense. I feel like it totally makes sense as a concept for pets. So like as we just mentioned, like cat personalities and phenotype are like very different voices, and each story in this collection has its own unique narration and message. However, they all like balance each other really well. And you also mentioned in your acknowledgments that this collection took 9 years to compose and put together. So how did you decide which story to include and the order in which they're presented?
Mm-hmm. This is a great question because when I was writing the stories, I wasn't really thinking of them as being in a collection necessarily at the time, especially as you mentioned, like the oldest stories in this collection are ones I wrote 9 years ago, 8 years ago. And I was really just figuring out like what is a story and how do I write a story? How do I want to write stories? And I was really experimenting a lot of the time and just like having fun with these, not thinking about what will it be like if I put them all next to each other and what would it read like if it's like, you know, from beginning to end as most people read books. Although I don't typically read story collections in that way, but I did order this. Yeah, I did order this book thinking, okay, someone is probably going to read it from beginning to end, or at least some readers will. So I tried ordering initially just out of like my own curiosity, doing it chronologically to sort of see, you know, how have I changed as a writer, having the oldest story first and like the newest story last. But when I read it in that way, it just didn't make sense, like emotionally across the stories. So then I decided, oh, let's try it thematically. Let's just like lump a bunch of thematic stories together, like family stories, friendship stories, like stories where someone is trying to figure out their sense of self. But that felt redundant at times, like back to back stories. If they're like the same emotional note, sometimes I get a little tired too if I read stories that are like the same note over and over. Uh, so then it was just an intuitive process of trying to figure out a balance between like variation and also resonance between stories, like the end note of a certain story kind of like bridging over to the next one, and like what kind of emotional state would I want a reader to be in for the following story, and that would make sense whether or not it's like an easy transition or like a big juxtaposition. To your question about what stories made it into the collection, I definitely cut quite a few, and it ended up kind of being, what stories do I feel the best about? What stories do I think are the strongest? And then there are a couple stories in here that like were maybes, and I left them in because of some sort of attachment that I had to them, or I wanted to, I don't know, have them next to another story too. So it's not really a clear or logical process. It's very much like, what do I feel? I guess it's my collection, so I get to decide and have whatever reason I want.
I mean, it makes sense. I feel like as a reader, personally, through my reading experience, I felt like every story like flowed really well, and like it was really interesting because I felt like reading this book, even though there were like different characters and like different stories, it felt like so connected, and I was like, so I don't even know. I just felt a lot of feelings. That's what I felt.
That's the goal. I feel like that's my goal, at least, just like to have a reader feel things when they're reading.
Oh yeah, I definitely felt a lot of feelings when I was reading this.
When
I was like, I don't know what I'm feeling, but it's a lot.
Yeah, especially when I was reading the recycling lady one. That one I was like, I feel like it's such a universal imagery or like universal thing we've seen. And I don't know, just like, ugh. And then many stories I was like, oh, I don't know what this feeling is. It's like either like awkwardness from the barbecue or like happiness from certain places. But yeah. So in addition to being an author, we noticed that you were also a tech reporter. So we were curious like whether or not your journalistic background really played a role in shaping the story or any of your stories.
Definitely. I worked as a tech reporter for about full-time for about like 2 years, and then I was freelance for many years after that. And as a journalist, I think what I learned the most, or what I carried over into my fiction writing, was this desire to be clear when I write. And I think, okay, so basically, like the goal of a lot of journalistic writing is to convey information. And it's just like as clearly as possible, like convey XYZ. And of course, there's like flourish and a certain level of voiciness to it. But for tech journalism, maybe not as much as other journalistic forms. And I do think that clarity is something that I guess is like a stylistic choice of mine in fiction that's carried over from journalism. Another thing is just like being a tech journalist is weird. And even though it was not that long in terms of like time in my life, it's something that really affected me, especially since it was like really one of my first jobs out of college, and where I don't know, felt a lot of attachment to the work itself. So I've carried that experience with me into a lot of my stories. For example, like Clara has the tech writer character in the beginning. Of course, my first novel is very much about a tech reporter, and just that angst, the angstiness of like being in the workplace and like wanting more from it, and not really knowing what it is that you want, and never actually getting that satisfaction that you're hoping to get. That's something that I think I love exploring in like work stories, even if they're not, even if they're not tech journalists, like for example, the first story, there's that angst. The angstiness is like the beginning of that story of this woman who basically has had this job that she's laid off from and is now lost and doesn't know what she's doing with her life and is like, what did I just do in this workplace situation? I just find the workplace to be a very, very ripe setting for stories.
Yes,
For
definitely.
sure. Yeah. I feel like whenever I read stories about the workplace, I'm like, wow, this is so real. Even though I am not working a corporate job and I'm still
Mhm.
this, but I hear from like my like friends and like peers who are in the workplace, and I'm like, wow, this is like so interesting. And I feel like there's like a lot to be said about it, especially since it affects like many people in our society. And it's like something that's like not really talked about. Maybe because people are like, oh, like everyone works, or like not everyone, but like
Yeah.
most people like work like a 9 to 5 or a corporate job. So
Or
Yeah.
that's like the path that you think you have to take in life. Like it's like
Mhm.
the path that we're kind of socialized into very young.
Yes.
So then you're like there and it's like, oh, this is what I've been working towards my whole life. This is kind of miserable. And I feel like there's a lot of existential crises around work in our capitalist modern society. So yeah,
What's a
it's
job without your like weekly existential
yeah,
crisis?
of course. I know. I also no longer work a 9 to 5, but I'm about to start one next month, and I'm very interested to see how it goes. Like I feel like there's this optimism, going into a
That's
new
true.
job. And then there's the reality of having that job. So that's like I don't know, the disconnect between these two is the challenging part as a person.
no, for sure. I mean, but I do hope that your upcoming job is actually optimistic and like a place, maybe not like of your passion, but at least like a place of like enjoyment and joy. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I do think that is probably why I love writing about work too, because I think I'm probably a little bit older than you too, but like I'm very much a millennial, and I do think that like millennials went into work like really, I don't know, putting a lot of themselves into work, and work became like a huge
Mm.
part of their identity. Like, okay, our identity, like we have to find meaning through work, or we have to do something that like we feel really passionate about, or that is like doing good in the world, at least to our standards or whatever. Um, and now I'm very much of the mindset of like work is work, and that's not who I am. And does it support like a living in general, then okay, it's like satisfaction enough.
That's so
Mm.
interesting because I would agree. Like, I feel like that's the millennial mindset, but then I identify as like Gen Z, a little, um,
Zillennial.
millennial, maybe more Gen Z. But whenever like I started my job, and then whenever I talk to people who are like entering the firm, I always say like, okay, yeah, like this job is a job, right? It's very important, but I think it's important to find joy outside of your
Mhm,
job too. Like have things that make you happy and have hobbies. And
mhm.
so I think it really resonates what you just said.
Yeah, yeah. I find it interesting though as a writer because sometimes I do see writing as work,
Mm.
but it's not the fraught workplace environment that I like to explore in my fiction. It's something different. It's like a kind of different relationship there.
That makes sense. Um, okay, so pivoting a little bit because you kind of like talked about this when you're explaining like your like the kind of like the reasoning why or like how being a tech reporter influences your writing, but we've noticed that many of your stories like take place in California and
Mhm.
in New York, both places that you've resided in yourself. So how much of your stories are drawn from personal life?
Mm. This is a question I get a lot because the first book I think got categorized a bit as autofiction. So there's always this question of how much of it is you, how much of this is your life or your experience, your lived experience specifically. And I've started to think a lot about how what we consume also in our personal life gets into the art. So for example, like I think the question really oftentimes means like, how much of these stories is something that you directly experienced? And the answer to that is like a lot and not a lot. I personally don't feel comfortable or don't always feel that comfortable writing stories that take place in settings where I've never been. I do have one story, the title story, in fact, that takes place in Singapore, and I've never been in Singapore, and that was just like a much more challenging experience to write the story. Like a lot more research, a lot more work going into it, a lot of like asking others to read it to make sure that I haven't gotten anything really wrong. But I tend to gravitate towards writing about places that I do know. And that happens to be California and New York. So yes, they are set there. But I have also been thinking about how personal life also includes like books I read, TV shows that I watch, just like other forms of media that like just influence and like live in my brain. And that too goes into a lot of the fiction. It's just like the stories are in conversation with like other stories that are out there in the world. And even though they might not be directly like lived experiences, it's still so much of my own interior personal life.
Interesting. Yeah. So we're going to dive into the book a little bit deeper, and we're very curious to know, I feel like this is hard because it's like asking you to pick a favorite child, but do you have a favorite story in this collection? And if you do, please let us know why. But we're also curious to know like which story was the most challenging to write, which was the most rewarding to write.
I don't have a favorite story in the collection. Although I have been asked this before and I have said that I do. I think it's just basically that my favorite is always changing, depending on like, I don't know, how I feel about myself, how I feel about the book, maybe like something someone told me about their experience reading a story, and that like changes my sense of what is my favorite. But I would say some favorites are Lee Fan, of course. That one I feel like is a favorite because it's, I think, an emotionally successful story, and it was also very challenging to write, to kind of answer your second part of the question. That was a very challenging story to write because I did write it in the way that it's read. I wrote it in reverse. So to kind of like get my brain into that like opposite time space was really hard. I think I wrote maybe a paragraph and was like, okay, that was enough for now. And then returned to it probably like a month later and was like, okay, I think I can try again to like go move backwards in time. But that was also one of the ones that required like the least revision just because of how long it took to write in that time, non-linear time. Another favorite of mine is Flies, and I think that's just because it was almost like the opposite experience. It kind of just like poured out very quickly. And I was like, I think I went into with the intention of writing that story with like, I just want to write something that feels natural to me. So that experience of writing Flies was so quick, and felt very, I don't know, close to me, that I love that story for that reason. And then I'm like, I don't have any favorites, but actually I have three. The other one is Other People, the last story. And the reason that one it feels close to, or that one I have like a fondness for, is because I think it's almost like an ugly duckling story for me, because it was rejected a lot by places that I did submit it to before, way before this collection was ever even like a thought in anyone's mind. And I was like, is this story not good? I mean, I revised it a lot each time, but I don't know. I still just feel like it's doing something that the other stories are not. And even though maybe it might not be like easily legible, it's a story that I felt like was, I don't know, important in a way to me. So I consider it a favorite as well. Yeah.
This just reminds me that I have so many favorites in this collection. I'm like, wow, I loved all of those. And then
I have like some non-favorites, my least favorites too. But yeah, thank you for saying that.
Wait, now I'm kind of curious. Which
No.
one?
I'll let you know, like off screen, what my least favorites were.
No problem. No problem.
I also am like, hey, if it is someone's favorite, then like the story did its thing on it, you know, for someone else, and that's good as well.
That's true.
That's fair. It's like it can be not your favorite to write, but it could like mean a lot to other people.
Yeah.
No. Okay, I'm so excited to talk about these stories. Okay, let's jump on to the next question. One of the things that stood out to me as I was reading it was that a lot of the short stories featured narrators at different stages of their lives. So for example, like Flies is like from the point of view of someone who's like younger, like a child basically, and then it like also like switches to like the point of view of like parents and elders in different stories. How do you think these stories and their messages of identity, belonging, etc. transcend time and age?
Yeah, I love this question, because kind of what I was saying earlier about how these stories are about people who are going through some sort of transition or some sort of loss, that really is not limited to any time period of our lives. Like, I think, well, I won't speak generally, but at least I am drawn to people who, whether they're like my youngest narrator, I think is 11, or, you know, in their 70s or whatever age they are, I'm drawn to these people who are going through some sort of change or going through some sort of life transition that they are grappling with in whatever form that might take. So for example, even though Farewell Hank, this story is narrated by a woman in her 20s, there are these mostly characters who are much older, and they are having to face mortality, really, and I don't know, coming transition to whatever they believe is their, you know, next phase, be it like total, I don't know, death, annihilation, or the abyss, or something else. And this is like what some of the characters in that story are dealing with. And I find that very moving, just like people who are still trying to figure out who they are, what's next for them, and want, I guess, more out of whatever it is their life is. I find that incredibly moving, and that's probably why I write characters who, no matter what age they are dealing with that in some way. Yeah. I think even when you're older, you're still trying to figure out, like, or at least, again, the characters who I'm drawn to who are older, and like they're still trying to figure out who they are and like what they're doing in the world. I mean, my mom, she retired a few years ago. My husband's parents retired a few years ago, and I think like even that transition from the life that they once had of like working, like raising kids, and then transitioning to like being empty nesters and then being retired. These are, there are a lot of questions around these transitions. Like, what am I going to do with my life now? What do I spend my like time and attention on? Who am I now that I'm not like a, full-time parent or full-time worker of whatever, box identity I had before. I think that those kinds of, I describe them as losses, but they're like losses that can like lead to something else, gains or growth, or that's not necessarily the case all the time in my stories, but I find those kinds of losses really, really compelling to explore.
It felt really like comforting, even though there was some discussion of loss and it felt melancholy. Part of me also felt pretty comforted by whatever the characters were experiencing.
Oh, that's nice. I'm glad. I think it can be comforting to know that there are, I don't know, I'm comforted by stories where I see like other characters or other people just like dealing with difficult emotions or challenging transitions or awkward situations. Just I find that comforting because it's like, oh yeah, me too. Like, same. Even if it is sometimes dark.
Yeah. I think like when I was younger, I thought that like, oh, like when I become an adult, I'll like have my whole life figured out and I'll just like know what I want to do. But like as I am now like a fully fleshed adult, I'm like adult. I'm starting to realize that like we also don't know what we're doing, and this is just like a feeling. Like I feel like part of like growing up is like realizing that you're just gonna like have this feeling forever, and that's going to be fine. Like I know like when I am like much older and I've like lived my life, I will have these feelings, and so it's like really reassuring to like read these stories of like people who are older and they like still have that feeling, but like they're also fine, even though it kind of feels like it should be like a negative feeling, but it's not really.
Yeah.
So, kind of transitioning, several of the stories explore power dynamics and female agency within relationships, which I thought was super interesting. So we're specifically thinking of like, she will be a swimmer, phenotype, care for life, and to get rich is glorious, which was a very, very interesting one. So really curious what motivated you to explore these like unconventional relationships.
Yeah, that's a great question because, gosh, I will say that I go into writing stories with no sort of intention in terms of like what I definitely want to explore, what kind of message I want to have. I am the kind of writer that each story feels like an act of discovery, and that's like a lot of the pleasure for me when I'm writing, that I don't know necessarily where it's going to go, what the characters are going to do, where the next sentence is going to lead. I just want to, I guess I just like don't really know what the story is until I'm actually writing it. And it just so happens that a lot of these stories do explore and sort of, I guess, try to navigate these questions around female agency, around power in relationships. And I think that's probably just because it's something that I've experienced in my own life, questions I have in my own life. In particular, To Get Rich is Glorious. I mean, this is a character who, Fufu is a character who is incredibly ambitious and very willful. She's different from, I would say in terms of characters, she's probably like the most different from me. But there are still parts of her that I can relate to, like this desire, this like churning desire that she has. And that is really difficult for her because it's suppressed by like the society around her and like the relationships that she has. It's not like she's given space to sort of like really flourish as a person, but she finds these other avenues to do so. And I think that story really was like a question of like what happens when you have this like very unbridled sense of ambition and desire, but there's not very many like outlets for you as a person, and particularly as a woman. What could happen to this type of character? And the others, phenotype. Yeah, I mean, that is just a curiosity for me. That was really like, what is this relationship dynamic, and what would it be like to I was very much in like an academic setting at that time, like living in a college town. And I do think that like living in college towns, you see these relationships where it's like a big question mark. Is this appropriate or not appropriate? This is about a girl who is a senior in college who is dating a man who is, 10 years, I would probably, or so older than her, and who's a postdoc in the same lab where she works. And I don't think it is. I think for me, like when I have these questions of like, is this appropriate? Is this inappropriate? The answer is, again, like, I don't know, yes and no. Like, this relationship is its own entity. And I feel like a lot of these stories and a lot of these questions that I have when I'm going into these stories, they don't necessarily come out with any sort of answers or clear. I don't know. Nothing is clear to me. Everything is nuanced, I guess. And these stories are just a way to explore these questions, really, that I have like lingering in my mind, subconsciously, sometimes even. Like, I think with Cure for Life, because both Phenotype and Cure for Life have this like weird power dynamic between like a younger woman and an older man, but like completely different relationships and completely different outcomes. Cure for Life, that story I initially wrote in the teenage girl's perspective. And it really was so much more about her coming into her own power and like understanding the power she had as as a teenage girl that she didn't realize she had before, and like wielding that power a little bit more. But the story, I don't know. I don't think I was able to capture it well enough in her perspective. So I ended up switching to the 24-year-old guy's perspective, man's perspective. And it just shifted the whole story.
Yeah.
In a way that I think helped, at least for me, answer some questions that I had about him. I had like a lot of questions about him when I was writing it in her perspective. And then when writing it in his perspective, was able to like get those questions answered while still like having the reader think about her position and her power or lack of power in their relationship.
Yeah. I think that's what I really loved about those stories. Like, you approach what people may view as like questionable relationships or like situations.
Yeah.
But by the very end, there's no like, this is right, this is wrong. But there's that feeling of like, like it just leaves you thinking more about it. And that's why I'm just like, I can't stop thinking about this short story for some reason.
That's another thing that I think I love about my favorite short stories, that there's no clear takeaway. It's more just like this almost unsettling feeling that's not necessarily unsettling in a negative way. It's just unsettling in the sense that like you look up from a story and you feel like you're seeing the world in a different way, or you have like new questions about the world around you. So it's like means a lot to me to hear that you had that kind of experience, because that's the kind of experience that I like hope for and hope to replicate, that I've also had when I read some of my favorite short stories and novels.
No, I definitely felt that as well for a lot of these stories. And I find it so interesting for Cure for Life specifically, how you said that you started off writing it from the girl's perspective, because I really enjoyed it because it starts, or it's like told from his perspective, but after you finish it, you kind of realize that like the main character is not him. The main character
Yeah.
is her. But it's like I don't think like I mean, I probably read other stories where it's like, oh, you realize the main character is not the person who's telling the story, but like something else. But it was just really interesting, and it definitely stuck with me. And I think I felt the same with She Will Be a Swimmer, because at the end of She Will Be a Swimmer, it was like, oh yeah, like this is kind of like what she always like wanted, and she is about to like start her life. And it's so interesting because I remember in the beginning of She Will Be a Swimmer, he's like, oh, he doesn't know that his life is about to end. Like, oh my gosh, this is so interesting.
Mastermind.
Yeah, literally, I was like, play Mastermind by Taylor Swift. Like, he doesn't even know. And it's so funny because like as I was reading that story, I felt a little bit just very disturbed about their like age gap. And I was like, this is like this guy who is like going after this very young girl, like this feels weird. And then at the very end, it's like, oh, like this is her plan. Like she always wanted this. I was like, oh my gosh, go her.
And then there's also in that story, I feel like the ghost characters that don't exist yet are like the children who are to come. But yeah, no, actually, I forgot that there's a big age gap there, which is so funny because I have never experienced that kind of relational age gap personally, but I guess it's something that I think about a decent amount. Or again, this is the mystery sometimes for writing, getting to hear what other people observe in the stories and almost like seeing something that I didn't see there. And now I have that question in my mind, like, why do I write these stories where it's like a younger woman and an older man? And why am I drawn to exploring that power dynamic? I don't know. Something that I can try to figure out in therapy.
Yeah, that's so funny. Okay, pivoting a little bit. Language as it relates to home and culture plays an integral part in stories such as She Will Be a Swimmer and Flies. How did the bilingual nature of the immigrant experience help shape these characters and their relationship dynamics?
Yeah. This one is definitely drawn from my own life. I personally, grew up as a child of immigrants. Both of my parents immigrated from China, and English is their second or sometimes third language. And being born here and having English, actually, I would say English was probably like my shared first language with Shanghainese. That kind of like bilingual household or like multilingual household as a child, I think like really affected my sense of who I was and who my parents were and how we fit into this I don't know, larger landscape, larger American landscape. So I think it really does shape my characters in a lot of ways. They have these like multifaceted senses of self. They're not like they're definitely, I think most of them don't have like a coherent whole sense of self. Not that I really know that any person has that, but my characters are very intentionally these people who inhabit multiple worlds, who have like these fractured identities. And that has a lot to do with language, because language is the way that it's the way we communicate. It's the way that we sort of like verbalize what we're experiencing, how we experience. There are certainly experiences that are beyond language or that are not language first kind of experiences, but it's how we end up like cataloging our lives. So having characters who, for example, in Flies, like the youngest son doesn't understand what his parents are even saying to each other when they're fighting. And the older daughter, who is the narrator of the story, is like, you should be trying to understand, even though she doesn't necessarily have access, like fluent access to the language. So each of these characters is inhabiting really a completely different experience of the same. They're all in the same room, they're all in the same kind of like situation, but they're having completely different experiences because of whatever access they have to the language. So I just find it really, I don't know, complex in a rich way, and really shapes how these characters understand each other and the situations that they're in.
No, for sure. I really wanted to ask this question because it felt very personal to me, because I also grew up in kind of like a bilingual household, and my parents speak Shanghainese at home. So I spoke Shanghainese at home, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like the first book I've read where like, or aside from Days of Distraction, they also spoke Shanghainese. But like, I'm like the same author, same thing. They was speaking Shanghainese, and I was like, this is so interesting. And I noted that moment in Flies that you were just talking about, where like the younger brother doesn't understand the language. And I remember the older sister was like, oh, like you should learn it. And he was like, no, I'm American. Like,
Yeah.
why do I need to learn this? And I kind of like remember not having an exact experience when I was a kid, but kind of like a similar experience when I was a kid, because I felt the same, where it's like, oh, like I'm an American, like why do I need to like learn these languages? But now that I'm older, that's a whole other story. But like now that I'm older, I like realize that like, yeah, exactly what you said. Like language is like such an integral part of it in like perceiving what is going on in that situation and your relationship to that situation, and like literally like shaping everything. So
Yeah, I feel you. I'm like, I actually was just spending time with a Chinese couple who immigrated here recently, and one of them Shanghainese and one of them's Taiwanese, and they speak Mandarin, and they're like, oh, do you speak Mandarin? And I was like, no, I don't, because I completely forgot it all when I was a child. And they're like, what? So you were fluent? And I was like, yeah, I lived in China and I was fluent for like a couple of years, but then it's gone. And it's just like, it's sad to me now as an adult to like, because it really does feel like when you lose a language, you lose like a part of yourself that was very attached to that language. Like I still have the memories, but they're all in English, which is very strange.
No.
Yeah.
That's sure. Like unlocked parts of my brain.
Yeah. And the act of translating those memories into a different languages probably did something wonky in my brain.
Yeah. Now, time to re-download Duolingo.
I've downloaded Duolingo multiple times, and then I'm like, so hard to stay committed.
It's also not fun in the way that like, you're like, I want to get to the good stuff. I don't need to know like he, she, they, it.
Yeah. I'm like, I need to watch more Chinese dramas, and then I'll eventually, because I've learned Korean words from watching K-dramas. So
yes,
I pivot myself to Chinese dramas.
No, for
There's
sure.
some good ones out there.
I don't know, this is like a tangent, but I don't know if you know, but there is like this like Netflix language extension where you could where it'll give you like subtitles in the language that you're like studying, and also like the language that you know. So like for me, if I was like studying Chinese and like watching a Chinese drama, it'll like give me English and like Chinese subtitles. And then if you click on the words, it'll like pause it and you can add it to your like vocab list.
Wait, I need this.
No, I didn't know that. That's cool.
Hold on, let me.
Would they do it in pinyin? Because like, there's no way I'm gonna learn the characters.
They have it, so you can like set it up where you can have it where it's like the characters and pinyin, or if you just want pinyin, that's like also fine. Yeah, you can like play with the settings. I need
this. I'm like about to marathon a couple dramas because this is also another tangent. Like my resolution at the beginning of the year was like, I'm gonna read Percy Jackson in Mandarin.
Oh.
And then I got to like one sentence and I have not touched it since.
That is a lofty goal. I'm impressed.
It was too overly ambitious, but you know, like dramas, I can do that. We can totally do that.
This is cool.
But
okay.
as Alexandra digs that up, our next question is, family was a major theme throughout the stories. We related a lot to persona development and The Visit, which explored how children worry about their parents as they age. And I know that Alexandra constantly worries about her parents. I spend so much brain power worrying about my mom. How has your understanding of parent-child relationships influenced these stories?
Yeah, same. I mean, I think, are you older daughters?
She's
No.
younger
Okay.
daughter. I'm only child.
Okay. But it's fine. We're all daughters.
Yes.
But I am the oldest daughter of 3. And I think being like a daughter, being like an oldest daughter for parents, as we get older and they get older, this becomes like, I don't know, just a more present part of our lives. Like you said, using a lot of brain power to worry, and I have done the same. And I think that intense kind of feeling, any kind of intense feeling that I have, like whether it's worry or love or extreme irritation, like I've experienced it with my parents. So that's something where I'm like, this is again a source of a lot of feeling and a lot of I don't know, questions, a lot of questions, a source of questions again. And so that's something that I again am drawn to in writing. I don't know who it was who said this to me or if I read it somewhere, but it was like, write about what breaks your heart. And I'm like, thinking about my parents, of course, parent-child relationships, like the source of, I don't know, our identities, our sense of what care is, what love is, what like neglect can be. There's just like so much in the parent-child relationship to unpack. I mean, you could write about probably for the rest. I mean, I could probably write about it for the rest of my days. I'm trying to like add in a little bit of, I don't know, other stuff here and there because it can be challenging too to like spend a lot of time in that space. But yeah, I would say my own parent-child relationship, or my relationship with my parents, and then also, of course, like I feel like I have a lot of friends who are children of immigrants, and we share a lot of experiences, and hearing like their stories too. The that like intense pull toward our parents is something that I do think is shared among a lot of children of immigrants, and especially of children of Asian immigrants. So that's, yeah, all of that has influenced the way that I depict that relationship.
Yeah, I think the most like emotional in a sad sense story for me was definitely The Visit because of
I've heard that.
I was like, oh my gosh, this is too much. This is too real. I need to like pause. So after or like in between reading the story, I was like, I need a moment, and then I kept going.
I mean, I'm glad to hear that. Sometimes I describe that story as like my most sentimental tearjerker story.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. We're gonna go into this fun speed round.
Okay.
But some of these questions are a bit hard, so they're not always like speedy. Okay. So first, what is your favorite Asian food and / or favorite food in general?
Mm-hmm. So I will say, because this one's really hard, it's hard to pick favorites, but I'm gonna go with Shanghainese braised pork belly when my mom cooks it. That's always delicious with some like radishes in there too. And then Shanghainese fried noodles. It's a very Shanghainese night. The fried noodles, I'm going to New York next week, and I saw that there's a Shanghainese restaurant in Flushing that looks really good. And I was just looking at the menu and I'm like, this is just like all my childhood favorites. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Wait, what is the restaurant? Because I feel like there's no good Shanghainese food in New York.
Okay, I think if you look up, okay, I have it. But if you look up like soup dumplings, Flushing, it's probably going to be that restaurant.
Okay.
Shanghai U Garden.
Oh, yes, it's on my list. I haven't been
there. Okay.
Mhm.
I'm trying to go next week.
Take me.
Come to New York.
Yeah. New York is where, yeah, I don't know where else has really good Shanghainese food, honestly.
I would say
LA.
626.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. I need to go to 66 and actually eat more. I'm like my mom's kitchen. So
Yes.
favorite food in, yeah, I don't know. All Asian foods. I'm really craving good Vietnamese food.
Mm.
I don't have access to that here either.
So good. Okay. What is a book you would recommend to everyone?
Okay, this one's I'm gonna give more than one. So one book that I always recommend, this is a non-Asian writer. I'll go with her first and put that aside. But I always recommend Lucia Berlin's Manual for Cleaning Women because in terms of short story writers, just like one of the best. I just love the way she writes short stories. So if you are into short stories, Lucia Berlin. And then another book that I recommend almost all the time, like to anyone, especially I would say probably to people who are like, oh, I read your book. What do you recommend I also read is Annalise Chen's So Many Olympic Exertions. That is a very moving book. And also someone who does like dialogue of immigrant parents really, really, really well. And I think I learned a lot from reading her book. It's also fragmented, which I love. And then another is Asako Serizawa's The Inheritors. And that book is just so, it spans like many years, many characters. It's also a book of stories. I'm not sure if they're kind of linked. Some of them are linked. And it explores sort of the ramifications of World War II on many Japanese characters, Japanese American characters. It's just a genius book, honestly. So I always recommend that.
Gotta add all of these to our TBR.
Okay, final speed round question. What is a book that you're looking forward to in the later half of this year or next year?
Okay. I'm going to shout out a book that is coming out, I think, in May 2024. So this is like really mark your calendars. It's coming soon-ish, called Their Divine Fires by Wendy Chen. She wrote a novel, but she has collections of poetry previously. She's written one book of poems. She's translated a book of poems by, I will have to look this up later, but an ancient or classical Chinese poet, Chinese woman poet, and that's going to come out at some point as well. But the novel is what's coming out in May. I just read it, I think like last month, and it's just totally gorgeous. Follows multiple generations of women who are just like affected by the world around them in different ways. So the oldest character or like the earliest characters in 1920s, 1910s, 1920s China. And then it follows like her for a while, then her daughter, then that person's daughter, and then like just like this lineage of women from China to Massachusetts.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay.
I feel like
That
I
sounds
learned
good.
it.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. And it has a very cool cover. I don't know if it's out yet, so I'm not supposed to like, I can't show it.
Amazing. Okay. So now we're curious, what are you currently working on? What can fans of yours expect next?
I am working on another novel. It is right now following multiple characters who work in a similar grocery store as the one that appears in Cure for Life. And that's all I can say really about it right now. It's morphing all the time, early stages or early stages of that.
We will keep an eye out for sure.
Yeah, who knows when it'll come out. It's not finished yet.
It's okay. Take your time, even though we are also very excited for it to release. It does release. Okay, so I guess our final question, which you may have already kind of answered in the past, but do you have any final messages for your readers?
Thank you. Thank you for reading my work. I mean, I think so much of writing is so solitary, and so much of what drew me to writing was this desire to, I don't know, be in communion with other people, like, because I love reading and I loved having that experience of like being in a world that someone else created. And I was like, always feeling like, I don't know, even if the author felt distant to me, like their work felt really close to me. And I think I was drawn to writing because I wanted to, I don't know, I wanted to be able to give that experience to somebody else, and wanted to like be in conversation with these other writers who I loved. So it just means the world to me that I don't know, that I'm actually being read, and that people are reading the stories and having reactions to them and having feelings about them. That's I think basically the dream of any writer.
Well,
Amazing. I think you conveyed those like feelings exactly. It's why we love like reading your book, reading books in general, why the book club exists. And it's an honor really to have you with us today. We enjoyed your book so much. And yeah, it's been a wonderful time. We're very excited. I personally am very excited to read Days of Distraction next. So I'm glad I haven't read that yet, so I can go. I have something to look forward to. But thank you everyone who joined. And our October book of the month is Others Were Emeralds, which is a Cambodian Australian. I don't know if it's a Cambodian Australian. It's like historical fiction-y, but we're very excited to read it together. More details are on our website and on Discord, and we're excited to see you next time.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.